Won't take too much of your time, but we have if you were in attendance in the last session, we had a great panel discussion with our students here. If anyone had a question they were not able to ask, feel free now, and they should be able to answer. We have one here. Okay. Okay. Well, I'm Bobby Harley. I'm a teacher for the South Carolina Department of Juvenile Justice. I'm also a mentor for the Next Generation South Carolina Action Team.
Oh, my name is Amaya Bussey. I go to Aiken High and I'm in 12th grade.
My name is Kayla. I'm in 12th grade and I go to Aiken High.
My name is Amir Robinson. I'm in 11th grade and I go to Aiken.
My name is Capono. I'm in 11th grade and I go to Aiken High.
And again, Next Generation, you'll see in the video, it is a leadership network where we adults, we try to stay out the way and we let them take the roles of leaders. And the goal is they are communicating with youth from these different sites. If you can look up here, we have Allendale, Aiken, South Carolina. Let me see, Atlanta, Georgia, Lawrence, Massachusetts, Vermont, and they come together about 3 times a year. And the idea is to communicate across cultural lines, and in doing so, they are developing literacy. They are learning, they are attending these meetings on policies, on different cultures and what's needed currently in their generation. So again, we try to stay out the way and we let them take their leadership and we follow their example. But you had a question, right?
Well, Miss Stone, mine and Amaya's 10th grade year, she taught us that in order to try to figure out like the best thing, not just go to one source, keep digging, go to different sources and see if there's some that do go together in a way that have the same idea. And if others aren't, then maybe the ones that got the same idea could be the same, but at the same time, the sources can be biased. So don't trust it completely. You can use it as an example or whatever, but she taught us not to trust it completely. So.
And of course, we have a crisis in South Carolina of not having enough teachers and everything. So I do know that like extra curricular classes like that, some schools I know, for example, like in Denmark where I taught my first teaching job, we just offered the basic history classes, U.S. history, government, those ones required to graduate. So, but many schools, from my understanding, it's rare that you will find a class dedicated solely to critical thinking. In South Carolina and maybe Georgia across. I've never heard of came across one. Any other questions? So briefly, we'll show this video to give you a better idea of what we are involved with Next Generation.
Welcome to the second gathering of Red Loaf Teachers Network Next Gen Summit. And whether you are from Lawrence, Louisville, Allendale, Aiken, the Navajo Nation, my former home city of Atlanta, or my current home in Vermont, I want to extend a warm and appreciative and enthusiastic welcome. Please don't underestimate the power of this network. It is extraordinary and I think has the real charisma in the network to change the world. We need you and your intelligence. We need you and your fearlessness. We need your commitment to being allies and advocates for social and educational change more than ever.
When we come together as youth, our voices are bigger than the voices that tell us that we don't have a voice. I think my biggest takeaway from the Navajo Nation trip was my ability to reflect, and I've noticed that I'm more aware of what I'm doing when I'm working on something or when I'm working with someone. I'm more aware of what I'm learning along the way and how I can use those things in the future. And also, I'm more aware of, you know, why I'm doing things. Like, sure, I may set a goal, but there's no point in me, you know, striving for that goal if I don't even know why I want that goal. So I think, you know, every workshop that I attended, every person that I met in the Navajo Nation really helped me with my ability to reflect.
The third and final step is to kind of creatively put that all together. When we were in the Navajo Nation in March, that was the introduction of all the new people that were going to come and join NGLN. I'm from Lawrence, so it's like a very small town, like landscape-wise, it's 7 square miles, but the population is somewhere around like 80,000. So we have an advantage there. We have a small community who's so loving and supporting, so we can work on the fly. And when you have a network like NGLN, where we're across the nation and across languages and cultures, that's been one of the biggest challenges of it all, is trying to understand and work with people on such a huge scale that none of us have ever been involved with. We're very used to our communities, and we're getting to know our communities deeper on a day-to-day level. So when you're able to connect to what it seems like a more accurate representation of the country, that's amazing. And that's been such a learning curve for me that I'm so grateful to be a part of.
True, honest change in a community must begin with young people, and young people are the most powerful agents of social change. And so by developing young people as activists, as leaders, as literacy leaders and social justice leaders, in that combination, giving them both the inspiration and the tools to share that inspiration with the world, we can make some real meaningful social justice change in our communities. The more that young people take the lead, the better. The Next Generation Leadership Network has given us some of the tools to help accelerate and expand this work.
If anybody needs help or has questions, anybody's confused, just like, you know, ask me. I'm an open book. I don't bite. I also want to learn more about you guys, where you're from.
I'm really excited to learn more about my leadership capabilities, since I'm kind of still stepping into them. And I think this conference, as it plays out, I'm like excited to see where I'll be compared to when I started the conference. You know, it's a short amount of time, but still there's so many people here, and you learn so many things that you walk away like a completely different person.
Next Gen is the latest iteration of really how to not just do little projects, but deeply more substantive work. And here's the key, where the students are at the center of it, not just the adults and the English teachers.
I've always been teaching from a way that's been what they call universal design for learning. I think I grew up teaching that way because I knew that I learned and accessed the world differently, largely very visually, as a deaf and hard of hearing person. I think that Dixie and Andrea were especially interested in the roles I might be able to play in advancing the involvement of students with disabilities in the Next Gen project.
So I want to ask you guys to take a second and write about, where did your journey begin? And I mean your journey here.
What brought me to this program was the establishment of the NCHO program, or the Navajo Community Health Outreach Program, in 2015. We were given an essay to write out an essay to see what interests we have and why we want to join this program. I mentioned that I believe that people with disabilities can be leaders as well. And our director of the program, actually Jim, he nominated me based on that sentence, which I find extremely spectacular. From then on, it was just a case of practicing what I preached to him, and I have.
I think since we come from such different communities, we all have a different understanding or definition of what diversity is. So I think this has been a really good opportunity for other sites who aren't as ethnically or racially diverse to really learn about the issues that are pressing our communities of color or of different sexual orientations and different life experiences in general. It's what we need now.
I teach for the South Carolina Department of Juvenile Justice. It's a great job because I come from a similar environment, at-risk single-parent home, so I can relate to the kids. My best teaching takes place after school. As far as applying what I'm learning at Bread Loaf, I believe it'd be most effective is if I can create a program, a writing program, maybe collaborate with the local libraries, the local governments outside of the walls of DJJ.
I don't know what I expected, but boy, I've been blown away. And I actually think that Next Gen is going to really up the ante for the whole future of BLTN.
The one major thing we've learned is the more we listen to the young people, the more we can adjust on the fly to move forward. I feel good about how far we've come over these last 2 years, but we have a long way to go, both in supporting the work at each site and developing ways and mechanisms so that the sites, the young people, can work together across the sites directly with each other as much as possible.
Words can't really describe how much the Next Generation Leadership Network and how much the Brett Love Teacher Network has changed my life. The summer I came down here, when I left this campus, I was a completely different person. I had a completely different outlook on life. My work ethic and my demeanor, my passion, my drive, it was all like elevated times 10 because I had finally found a group of adults and a group of young people who understood the struggle to be heard.
We have such different opinions and experiences. We have different languages. We have different ways of approaching advocacy in our local communities. But because Ford has invested in networking these very different sites, we are learning to communicate across difference with mutual respect. And if I'm not going to be embarrassed to say this, even with love. Every young person, especially in an economically distressed community and environment, must have access to a network of support like this, where they learn that they are capable of academic success, of civic engagement, and of relating to each other in a civil and respectful way. So that's what we're doing.
Thank you all for sitting through this very long and hot presentation. Does anybody have any quick questions, thoughts, comments for any of us up here?
So we are in a room of educators focused on history, so I think we're in the right place at the right time on this Saturday afternoon. I want to thank Vernon Burton for his brilliance in conceiving this idea and finding it right and appropriate to end in this way, about how do we take all the materials that we've gathered over the last many days and use those in the classroom. I want to do something, and students who are from Aiken realize this. Very few historians can be brief. And my task is to really set the stage. Now, Amanda's parents are here, so I know I need to hurry up and get out of the way, and particularly since Jim Loewen is speaking. But I'm struck by this next gen statement that was passed out to all of you. The network seriously engages the question, what does it mean to offer robust leadership and learning experiences to youth, ages 15 to 21, from youth as they prepare themselves for social action in a complex world? We must ask then, how can we help these youth prepare themselves to be positive factors in their communities and their arenas of work? Now, I assume this was written by someone quite recently, in 2018, 2016, 2017. But today what I want to think about, if you look at the image on the screen, is that this description, these questions, of course, have been asked many generations. And part of what I think is important for our discussion today, particularly those of you who teach in the South Carolina Public Schools, is to what degree this very conversation, these very guiding principles that shape the Gen X group who's here, how might there be roots in the history of this state with regard to this very same vision? So how might this very description be then applied to South Carolina in the 1860s? How might the designers, the writers of the post-Lincoln 1868 Constitution see themselves answering the very question that is posed to us in this statement that was just passed out? So for example, why might the architects of the 1868 Constitution in South Carolina include, as a part of the Constitution, the following statement: all the public schools, colleges, and universities of this state supported in whole or in part by public funds shall be free and open to all the children of the state without regard to race or color. Why might that be an intentional insert in the 1868 Constitution? And young people who are here, how might that very article in the 1868 Constitution set the stage for the very work that you're doing now? And how might the work you're doing now and the work we're doing collectively be shaped, informed, or indeed inspired by the very history that we've been discussing and debating over the last, 72 hours, Vernon? How long has it been going on? Since Wednesday night. So think about that. How might this very question then serve for me and others the very foundation of the civil rights struggle of the 20th century? So look at this quote, free public schools, and then take a moment to look at this image. Does anyone know what we see here? The Constitution called for free public schools without regard to race or color. And what you see here is an image taken in the fall of 1873 on the steps of the chapel of the University of South Carolina. And these are students who were enrolled at USC Columbia in 1873 as part of what was called the normal school. So that's a school for what? Teachers. These young women with state funding that is a direct result of the 1868 Constitution are now being educated at what is now the flagship university. Well, who are these teachers? What are they learning on that campus between 1873 and 1877 when the student body enrollment of the University of South Carolina is 90% African American, 90% Negro? What are they learning during that period of time? And how is what they're learning challenged at the very moment and comes crushing down with racial violence throughout the 1870s, but specifically in 1876, a topic that was underscored in several discussions in previous sessions this past weekend. So what occurs in 1876 that compels some of these very teachers to be dismissed from the university without their degrees? Now, pay close attention to the woman in the dress, in the checkered dress in October of 1873. You'll see that photograph yet again. So the 1868 Constitution is a civil rights document, very unlike the South Carolina 1895 Constitution. Now, those of you who are in this room who teach South Carolina history, what are the takeaways of the 1895 Constitution? How indeed is it unlike the 1868 Constitution? What makes those constitutions strikingly different? Yes? Say that again so the young people can hear you. All right, so that's a good framework. The 1868 Constitution is a reconstruction document, and the 1895 is a deconstruction. Let's look closely here. This is a part of the debate on the floor of the South Carolina Constitutional Convention of 1895. They're making a critique of the deliberations in 1868. It is a bogus document, they argue. Why? Because it was made by aliens. You know those people, carpetbaggers. It was written by Negroes and natives without character. Those would be scalawags, who are all scalawags, carpetbaggers, and Negroes, enemies of South Carolina, who are designed to what? Degrade our state, insult our people, and overturn our civilization. And in one of my classes, we spend all session trying to understand what the word "our" means in this document. Now, the 1868 Constitution pushes for integration of schools. The 1895 Constitution says very clearly, separate shall be provided for the children of the white and colored race. A student, a next generation student, writes in the campus book, a newspaper, about Negro History Week being taught. And the student writes that we are fortunate that we have a principal at this school named J. Andrew Simmons, who believes the lessons taught during Negro History Week should be taught well beyond that week. And then the very end quote says, we feel that he, the student, is by no means an exception to the youth of the nation, which will not be satisfied with a complacent attitude, but must conquer the obstacles of race prejudice in their path. Written by a student in 1939. So what are the lessons being conveyed to that student by teachers during the Great Depression that would lead that student to write an article like this in 1939? The very same teachers who helped shape this attitude among the students also were a part of an extraordinary moment in American history that is also outlined in this book, History Denied, called the Southern Negro Youth Congress. Has anyone ever heard of this group before? Maybe three. It is called SNCC, the first SNCC. The Southern, and that's what they call them, the Snickers. The Southern Negro Youth Congress has an extraordinary meeting, not in Birmingham or Atlanta, but in Columbia, South Carolina, in October of 1946. And the goal of the Southern Negro Youth Congress was to prepare young people for social action in a complex world. That is not their quote, I'm reading from the New Gen statement, but that is explicitly what the goal was, to train young men and women, black and white, from around the world about how to begin shaping a civil rights agenda. Now, two of the teachers who were at the meeting of the first Southern Negro Youth Congress were some very prominent figures. On the left, the tall, striking figure, one teacher was named Paul Robeson, who came to Columbia to inspire these young people. Another teacher was the gentleman on the right, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, who speaks at the closing event of the Southern Negro Youth Congress and encourages young people to become foot soldiers in an emerging civil rights movement. And he makes the declaration that that movement will be rooted in the South, and the foot soldiers of that movement will be young people. And right before that meeting in Columbia, they hold, Vernon, workshops. And in the workshops that were held in the summer prior, they developed a curriculum for what do you teach young 18, 19, and 20-year-olds in 1946 about the complex world around them. So if you are a teacher, you teach courses on winning the ballot, 1946, not 56, 66, 46. Winning the ballot, defending civil rights, world affairs, job programs, education for democracy. You teach young men and women public speaking. You teach them parliamentary procedure, public relations. You teach about mimeographing, writing press releases. And the teacher for this workshop was a teacher trained at an historically black college, Benedict College, and also trained to teach math at the historic Booker T. Washington High School. And the teacher's name was Majeska Monteith Simpkins, whose photograph is there on the board there, conveniently placed by her great niece, Professor Petty. Not sure if she told that about her history, but there is a connection. So in 1946, they meet for this event And they meet in the largest facility in Columbia, South Carolina, the Township Auditorium. You see a photograph, and Professor Bursey and I have many images of this moment, but we have this photograph of this huge American flag across the stage. But what we don't have, regrettably, is a photograph of the room, of the huge arena. And what we do know by correspondence and newspaper accounts is that all of those who gathered for this Congress are surrounded by huge 6-foot photographs of leaders of the Reconstruction era that were ordered and printed by the Southern Negro Youth Congress, who discussed the important role of Reconstruction history in shaping a civil rights agenda for 1946. Now, the longer version of this talk delves into why Columbia, what's going on in 1946, and unfortunately, this book describes a great deal of it. So this is my shameless plug for History Denied. One of the important comments that compels this is earlier that year in 1946, this gentleman, Isaac Woodard, a uniformed World War II veteran, is discharged on February 12th, 1946. And before he makes it home on that same day, he is blinded in a racial attack by police near Batesburg, South Carolina. Those who come to Columbia that October are inspired by the grave injustice experienced not only by Isaac Woodard, but countless African Americans who defend democracy abroad and yet find themselves victims of racial bigotry at home. And that is underscored. To fast forward, May 17th, 1954, the famous Brown v. Board decision. Professor Burton and many others remind us that as we talk about this critical case, that we extend our reach and focus to earlier legal struggles rooted here in South Carolina. Now, if you go to the Center for Civil Rights History and Research website at the University of South Carolina, you will find a fully digitized collection of Reverend Joseph A. Delane, an African Methodist Episcopal minister and teacher who lived in Clarendon County, South Carolina, who begins a movement to challenge inequities in public schools and faces significant reprisals for doing so. This photograph is just one of those reprisals of Reverend Delane and his family standing on the ruins of their home, burned down by, quote, unknown assailants. But in the papers are not only these types of images, but all of the strategies and all of the litigation that went into shaping what was described as the thrust case of the Brown v. Board decision, Briggs versus Elliott. Today is December 1st, 2018. 63 years ago, this critical moment occurs in American history. Now, the next gen students, what happened on that day? What happened on December 1st, 1955? Now, the students. What did she do? And what happened next in American history? What happened next? What happened next? You know what happened next. Martin Luther King showed up. That's what happened next, right? King showed up right after this date happened. And before Jim started criticizing textbooks, that's exactly how it was described. And yet, in South Carolina, we've been very intentional in putting a caveat here to show that although there is this important moment in Montgomery, Alabama, there are extensive roots that extend across the country, including in South Carolina. So the Brown v. Board decision is May 17th, 1954. Within 1 month of that event, of this critical Supreme Court case, a 19-year-old student named Sarah Mae Fleming boards a bus in downtown Columbia. And she, like Rosa Parks 17 months later, is asked to leave her seat in the whites-only section of the bus. Sarah Mae Fleming refuses to do so, and ultimately when asked to move to the back, she decides to simply get off the bus. And as she tries to exit, the bus driver elbows her in her abdomen, injures her, forcing herself to move toward the back of the bus and exit in the rear of the bus. When she exits the rear, Sarah Mae Fleming could have easily gone home, but she does not. She goes to the home of Majeska Monteith Simpkins, who gets her a very good lawyer, and they file a lawsuit against the owners of the bus company in Columbia. The owners of the bus company is a group you know called South Carolina Electric and Gas Company. And the case Fleming v. SCE&G becomes an important case later in Rosa Parks. Now, when did Rosa Parks happen? Let's remember again. What's the date? Dates? December 1st, 1955. Now, take a look at this newspaper. It just happens to be Rosa Parks' hometown newspaper. Notice the date, July 15th, 1955. Now notice the date, July 15th, 1955. Rosa Parks has yet to sit down on her bus. And yet the headline story in her morning newspaper is U.S. courts rule bus segregation illegal. And they reference a case in Columbia, South Carolina, of Sarah Mae Fleming. Now, the teachers in the room who teach U.S. history or South Carolina history, how many of you teach the Sarah Mae Fleming story? How many of you have never heard of the Sarah Mae Fleming story? Professor Loewen, this is the work we have to do here. When this photograph is taken, Sarah Mae Fleming says, you know, I believe sitting on the bus was the right thing to do. I just hope it does not cause too much trouble. Now, those of you from South Carolina, and Vernon has been leading the charge here, very often South Carolina is given a pass when it comes to civil rights history, because the pass is we were not Alabama. We were not Mississippi. When in fact, indeed, we were. I hope it does not cause too much trouble. Ask the young man on the left. Now, students, imagine you are a senior about to graduate and you are expelled from school. You'll be so what? Yeah, I'm sure you would. Fred Moore, who's now an 83-year-old gentleman in Charleston, was the student body president at South Carolina State in 1956. He leads a boycott of local stores in Orangeburg, South Carolina, and when told to stop the protest, he refuses, and he is expelled from school 2 months before graduating. The very same year, 20 teachers in Ellery, South Carolina, are fired from their job as teachers in that school district. Now, does anyone know why they were fired? Were they incompetent? They lack credentials? Why are they fired? They're fired because they refuse to resign from the NAACP, which made it illegal. In South Carolina, in 1956, it is illegal. It is illegal. Well, in South Carolina, one cannot have a state-paid job. Being a member of the NAACP or any other communist-influenced organization. Quote, those are not my words. Those teachers are dismissed. The Klan has a resurgence in the state. The White Citizens Council's model for Mississippi is borrowed directly, and 300 chapters of the White Citizens Council are all across the state of South Carolina. And very recently, I started reading the correspondence. within the White Citizens Council, and anyone who says we were not Mississippi or Alabama have not read those documents and the communications between leaders across the state. Part of what I do know, as we talk about ways to teach about race relations, we have to now uncover the reign of violence and terror in this state that in some ways explains why the movement in South Carolina was so motivated. What are these people fighting against? What are they fighting back toward? This is a New York Times headline in the summer of 1960. Many of you know the story of Greensboro. But 1 month later, the New York Times carries a story about the largest student demonstration to date occurring in Orangeburg, South Carolina. And when you read the full text, it describes young men and women in Orangeburg who are what? Who are being turned around on the streets by police dogs and water hoses. And now, if you go to our website, you will see the news footage that shows exactly what this story describes. An episode in the state's history that's been not largely underscored or fully studied. Now, the role of young people in the movement here is one that fortunately is being told in greater detail. You met one of those persons helping to tell that story 2 days ago, those who were here. This is a photograph by Cecil Williams of young men and women marching in downtown Orangeburg. These are photographs, the one on the left from Charleston, the one on the right, Greenville. Anyone can recognize the gentleman on the top left, the one on the right? Anyone recognize? He was a football how many football players are here? How many football players are here? The gentleman on the top left, on the right picture of the top left, was the quarterback of the Sterling High School football team named Jesse Jackson in 1960. In 1961, students in Rock Hill, South Carolina, agreed to go to jail and not receive bail to come out of jail. And one of the amazing things is that this becomes a catalyst for other events across the country, inviting members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the second SNCC, to come to Rock Hill to support those young people. Now, in our civil rights collection at USC, we have a lot of moving footage, meaning old newsreels. And one of the pieces that we had in our collection was this footage here. So this is a still shot of footage. And all we knew were these were young Negro students in 1961 at the York County Penitentiary. And then very recently, we realized that one of those young Negro students right there on the left is Congressman John Lewis of Atlanta, who came to Rock Hill in 1961 to support the young people in Rock Hill. And a few months ago, John Lewis is in our office stunned that this picture even existed. He has no memory of coming to Rock Hill at that time. And in fact, in his memoir, it is not even mentioned at all. He says the first time he comes to South Carolina is when he's beaten in the Freedom Rides, when in fact he had been there months earlier. And this photograph underscores that. I want to conclude by talking about one last event, and then Vernon said take any questions. So the year 1961 is an interesting moment in time. On the left, who talked about, which student mentioned people wearing Confederate flags in school? All right. Take a look at this picture for a moment. On the left are young students in Rock Hill who are responding to the protest of the African American students in downtown Rock Hill. Notice the symbols they use in their opposition. Well, look at the photograph on the right. Does anyone recognize those individuals? On the left is Governor Ernest Fritz Hollings. In the middle is Senator Olin D. Johnston. And on the right is candidate John Kennedy being greeted at the Columbia Airport. And Hollings is extending to him a gift on behalf of the citizens of South Carolina. Notice the gift that Kennedy does not know what to do with. the Confederate flag. Within months of this event, we began to see a series of pronounced oppositions to civil rights in South Carolina, a full-page ad taken out in the local newspaper of those who were against the movement. Likewise, a new organization established called the National Association for the Preservation of White People. And the president of the group, who wanted to preserve our way of life, was a young restaurant owner named Maurice Bessinger. And when you read the language of this letter and others, it's very interesting to see what types of arguments and rationale were used to maintain civil rights. So my takeaway here is, as much as we are able to illuminate the struggle of young people in crafting an agenda for civil rights, as teachers, as scholars and researchers, I believe we have to do more work to document more thoroughly those in this state who stood in pronounced opposition to that change, and to uncover more closely what are those arguments being used in that opposition. Within weeks of that newsletter being published, these young students marched to the State House of South Carolina. Now, how many of you know about the Selma to Montgomery March? The famous Selma to Montgomery March. How many of you know about the marches in Birmingham, Alabama, that led to attacks by police dogs and water hoses in 1963? Well, two important cases emerged from those struggles. One is called Hosea Williams versus the governor of Alabama in 1965. Hosea Williams sues Alabama to gain access to public roads to march from Selma to Montgomery. In downtown Birmingham, Fred Shuttlesworth sues the city of Birmingham so that young people could march through the streets in Birmingham. Both cases are won in their favor, but both cases cite a precedent civil rights event in Columbia, South Carolina, that occurred on March 2nd, 1961. The March 2nd, 1961 event was this event where 300 students and 4 adults marched from a historic African-American church to the State House. And they're going to the State House because their argument was, we're done with lunch counters and hotels and theaters. We're going to the source of power. And we're going to demand state leaders take a more active effort to enforce integration. They agree, young people, to march through the streets of Columbia in silence. And they get to the State House. These are all photographs taken by the young photographer, Cecil Williams. But then something unpredictable happens. The young people are joined by a few adults, including this gentleman named David Carter. And David Carter was a Baptist preacher training at Benedict College. And David Carter did not agree that the students should march in silence. And so he tells the young people, if you want your freedom, you should say so. And they were like, you said what? If you want your freedom, say so. And guess what the students do? They begin marching and singing and clapping and dancing, marching, singing, clapping, and dancing straight to jail. 180 of them are arrested on State House grounds for disturbing the peace, for singing that disturbing anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner, and singing it with too much bravado was the statement used by the city manager. Their arrest and their conviction in 1961 leads to a major United States Supreme Court case in 1963 called Edwards versus South Carolina, a civil rights case taught in most law schools in the country, and yet few of us as teachers know much about this important case. Nor do we know much about those adults who were involved, including this adult who was the pastor of Mother Emanuel AME Church that we now all know about in Charleston. Dylan Root, the perpetrator of the massacre in 2015, studied closely the history of Mother Emanuel. He knew of its civil rights roots, its Reconstruction roots, and its antebellum roots, and writes about it. He also knew about preacher of Emmanuel AME Church. Notice at the very top, those who can read it. John, what does it say on the very top? Very top. You now have too much freedom. This was a death threat letter received by the pastor of Mother Emanuel right after this event. And he responds by becoming even more active in civil rights activities soon thereafter. One of the college students arrested that day is now the majority whip of the United States Congress, named James Clyburn, who was also arrested that day for disturbing the peace. The final person I'll mention is this gentleman, whose name was Frederick Hart. Frederick Hart, on March 2nd, 1961, was a 17-year-old white art major at the University of South Carolina, who happened to be present on the day of the big march at the State House. And the 17-year-old white student, as the march happens, he gets closer and closer to the action. And a policeman sees him looking quite suspicious and says, are you a member of the NAACP? And Frederick Hart looks at the policeman and says, yes, I just joined. And he goes to jail. And this is a photograph of Frederick Hart in jail, sitting between two students at Benedict College. Now, has anyone ever heard of the name Frederick Hart? Frederick Hart is, and I still don't know if he's expelled or he's encouraged, unquote, to leave the University of South Carolina. But he leaves within weeks of this arrest. And he goes to Washington, D.C., and he becomes a very famous sculptor. If you've ever been to the National Cathedral and seen the extraordinary sculpture work there, it is the work of this student, Frederick Hart. If you've ever been to the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, right across from the famous Mile End Wall, there's a statue of 3 Vietnam soldiers crafted by Frederick Hart, the student who was dismissed from the university. The day Frederick Hart left the university, he said, I have no shame about what I've done. But if there's ever a moment for people of conscience to speak up, that moment is now. And despite his own work and the work of many of these people, we now know very little about them. The gentleman on the left was named Reverend Leroy Hogan, who I met during the course of our research. And when I met Reverend Hogan, he said, what happened to the white guy who was next to me? Now here I am like, what? Now there was only one white guy that I knew about. And I showed Reverend Hogan this photograph. I said, Reverend Hogan, are you the person on the left? He said, yes, I am. Reverend Hogan today is 81 years old. I said, is this the young man you remember in 1961? He said, yes, it is. And I began to connect the dots to Reverend Hogan to tell him about what happened to that white man there. Now, I end here by saying this type of teaching, these types of workshops, this type of research is so critical now because the very young activists, that next generation of 1950 and 1960, they were 19 and 20 years old then. How old are they now? Pushing toward 80. And part of our challenge at the Civil Rights Center and our collaboration with others like the Progressive Network is to capture as many of those stories as we possibly can so that you and all of us will be better equipped to teach that next generation. I talked too long. I apologize. I'll now take any questions. I'm going to stop questions.
How did I get so interested in history? I'm a sociologist. And the answer comes from my first full-time teaching job, which was at Toulouse College, That's Tougaloo. There will be a quiz on that. It's a small college, it's a black college, and it's in far-off Mississippi, but it's a very good college. And I enjoyed myself all to pieces there. I taught there for 7 years. And the first year teaching there, I was teaching the courses I expected to be teaching in sociology, but I was also asked to teach one section of a course called the Freshman Social Science Seminar, which introduced students to, you know, the drill, Soc, Anthro, Psych, Econ, Poli-Sci. And it did this, it was invented by the history department, it did this in the context of African American history. Made sense, 99% of our students being African American. Now, when you're in that context, that's of course the same chronology as, shall we say, regular US history. And so second semester begins not just after Christmas, but also just after the Civil War. Let's do a little call and response. And I noticed when you tried it, everybody was too quiet. So teachers they hate to be wrong, and so they hate to say anything. But you guys are going to be loud, right? It not only begins after Christmas, it begins right after the Civil War with the period known as?
Reconstruction.
At least he shouted it out. Yeah, Reconstruction. Okay. Well, so I had a new group of students that what I had was an aha experience, although it might be better called an oh no experience. It's so vivid that I literally remember where I was sitting in the room at the time, even though this happened a long time ago. It was on a January afternoon, first afternoon of the new semester. I didn't want to do all the talking that I had 17 new students. I said to them, okay, what is Reconstruction? What happened then? What images come to your mind? And 16 of my 17 students, all African American, said Reconstruction was that period right after the Civil War, when blacks took over the government of the southern states, but they were too soon out of slavery, and so they screwed up, and white folks had to take control again. Is that all right? There's at least 3. Now, this is the way I would teach this, incidentally. You might even say, if you're going to be a classroom teacher, you might even say, I heard this really old guy, that's me, who had this experience. This was how bad it used to be taught. And you might ask students, you know, what's your image of Mississippi? See what your 7th graders or 11th graders or your first-year students at Clemson or whoever you're teaching, see what they say. But anyway, there's at least 3 direct lies in that sentence, are there not? Can I see from you guys, you look like an intelligent table, what's lie number 1? Come on now. Oh, for God's sake, now look at this. This is a better table. Who said that? Yeah. What did you just say? You are. That is disappointing to me, but okay. What did you just say, though?
I'm a college professor. I said black people are stupid since nobody else was going to.
Yeah. I'm delighted that you spoke up. I don't know what's the matter with. Okay. The first lie, though?
That black people took over.
Thank you. Black people took over the government of the southern states. All of the southern states had white governors throughout the period. All but briefly in South Carolina had white legislative majority. Okay. Black people never took over. Now this table, what's lie number 2? Damn it, excuse me. No, shh. Lie number 2. This is actually amazing. I've never quite done this to a group before. Lie number, for God's sake, repeat this statement. It was you didn't hear it? You didn't know there was going to be a test. There you go. Write this down. No, don't write it down, for God's sake, because then you'll teach it. Reconstruction was the period right after the Civil War when blacks took over the government of the southern states, but they were too soon out of slavery, and so they screwed up, and white folks had to take control again. There's actually 4 lies in there, but so the first lie is that blacks took over the, government of the southern states, and the second lie, it's, what? That they, wait a minute, she just already said that one. You're repeating her. What? Isn't too soon after slavery, isn't that an interesting concept? That's not even what I had in mind, is that I said there was 3 lies, and then I switched to 4th. That's a perfectly good choice. Isn't that an interesting concept? As if slavery is an educational institution. It is, of course, a felony to teach even free blacks how to read or write in Mississippi in 1859 during slavery time. So that's perfectly okay. Good answer. Help those folk when you get a chance to be more bold, for God's sake. The lie I was looking for is that the Southern government screwed up during Reconstruction. Okay? Without exception, and we've already heard about this, they passed the best state constitutions across the South that they've ever had, better than the ones that they labor under today. Okay? They started the public school system for both races. Mississippi had scattered public schools for white folks in the larger and more advanced towns, but no system that included the whole state. We've already discussed that it was, of course, a felony to teach blacks any damn thing in a school, so they had no schools for blacks, so they started the public schools for both races. They did various other interesting things in every state. Some that were so popular that the next conservative reactionary governments had to continue, a couple of them, because they were so popular. So they did not screw up. Mississippi in particular had better government during Reconstruction than at any later point in the entire 19th century. So then the third lie that I was looking for was whites had to take control again. A certain group of whites took control, white racist Democrats, and then we have to get into the whole thing about teaching students how the two parties in 1964 completed a flip-flop on this matter, but it was the Republicans who were interracial and let's just be honest about it, good on race. I mean, they weren't perfect, but they were good on race relations, good on equal opportunity, and so on in the 19th century. And in 1964, the Republicans chose to become rather explicitly the party of white supremacy, which the Democrats had been. Democrats called themselves the white man's party into the 1920s. The only reason they stopped after 1920 is because women got the right to vote. It wasn't because they changed on race. Okay, so I'm listening to my students, all of them black, saying the one time that their group was center stage in American history, they screwed up. Now, can you hear me okay? Okay. Now, if it were true, that's another matter. We have to figure this out, what went on. But it is not true. In fact, it's what we in sociology call BS, all right? That's bad sociology? No. You were thinking. I told you 16 out of 17. One student disagreed. He knew he was in a minority of one. He was real hesitant. He actually said, and I'm quoting him, I remember it, so he said, gee, I didn't think they were so bad. Like, didn't they start the public schools? And I wanted to go over and kiss him, and I said, where did you go to school? Thinking, somewhere in Mississippi, there's a teacher like the one you mentioned, and I'll have to say, this kind of teaching, really bad teaching, did go on in South Carolina too. It wasn't all the really good teaching you're talking about, anyway. And he said, almost all of our students are from Mississippi. He said, Gary, Indiana. So I couldn't go hug her or him because they were in Indiana. Well, for about a year and a half after that, I tried to get history folks to write a new textbook because I went to nearby high schools, and this was just before massive school desegregation in South Carolina and Mississippi and Alabama, and the Deep South. So I went to nearby black high schools. I saw black teachers being taught, black teachers teaching this BS, white supremacist history to all black classes because they were just teaching what was in the book, okay? Particularly in the book for Mississippi history, which was a required course in 5th grade and then again in 9th grade. The requirement had been doubled in response to Brown because this is part of preserving our Southern way of life, explicitly said by the legislature. And by the way, some of you have been to this conference and you heard Armin Dörfner speak yesterday. He's a famous civil rights lawyer from Charleston. He was then in Mississippi, and his then wife, who died all too early of diabetes, she was finishing her BA at Millsaps College, the white school in Jackson. And so I met her because everybody teaching at Tougaloo knew the civil rights lawyers. And she wrote a paper on the really bad reactionary state history textbooks for state that were used K-12 in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina. And they were all terrible. But Mississippi's was actually slightly better than the one in South Carolina, if you can imagine that. But the one in Mississippi said exactly what my students told me, all right? It's a good school, Tougaloo. They had learned what they had been taught, even though it was white supremacist BS. And so, anyway, finally, after I couldn't get any historians to do this, I got a grant and got some students and faculty at Tougaloo, and also some students and faculty at the white school, Millsaps, and we wrote a new history of Mississippi for this course called Mississippi Conflict and Change. It's a terrific, I modestly say it's a terrific book. And we put it to the state textbook board. Like South Carolina and like every southern state, Mississippi adopts books statewide. You all know the issues in Texas. Well, they're not just limited to Texas. In most topics, Mississippi adopted 3 to 5 books. In this course, Mississippi history, 9th grade, high school, they only had 2 books, which we might call ours and theirs. And by a 2 to 5 vote, the 7-member textbook board rejected our book. There were 2 black folks and 5 white folks on that board. I think you can do the math, okay? I'll say one more word about that. We took them to court. The case, it's time for a joke, isn't it? We haven't had a joke. Not even a joke, it's true. The case is called Loewen et al. Versus Turnipseed et al. There's only 2 states that I know where there's people named Turnipseed, this one and Mississippi. I know Tom Turnipseed quite well, and this was John Turnipseed. Very different politics. And so I got to choose the lead defendant, and that's why I chose him. That's kind of a joke. I mean, I did choose him because of his name. And the case is pretty well known, but I screwed myself out of my 15 seconds of fame, right? Because Brown v. Board, for shorthand, is called Brown, thank you. Plessy v. Ferguson, for shorthand, is Plessy v. Ferguson, for shorthand, is Plessy. But let them call in response. And Loewen v. Turnipseed, for short, is called Yes. It's really pretty well known, and so of course it's known as Turnipseed. If I just, made Smith the lead defendant, I'd be all set, but I didn't. Okay, so the case actually had a dramatic moment, and I'm going to mention it to you because it relates to what we're doing here. There is in the book, I may even come upon it in my presentation here. There's a picture of a lynching, okay? At that time, not one state history textbook had a photo of a lynching. At that time, not one U.S. history textbook had a photo of a lynching, okay? John Turnip, we had expert witnesses from around the United States and all around Mississippi testifying that not only our book was good and should have been adopted, it was better than their book, etc. And then it was their turn. And Turnipseed was on the stand, and the Assistant Attorney General for the state of Mississippi asked him, "Why did you reject this book?" And he had us all turn to the page with the lynching photo. And he said, and I quote him exactly, he said, "Now some teachers, especially white lady, some students, Can I bring you guys back? Thank you. It's actually messing with my synapses. And I don't have that many left. He said, some students, especially black male students. Here's what he exactly said. I really did have screwed up synapses from that. He said, some 9th graders, especially black male 9th graders, are pretty big. And we worried, or at least I worried, that teachers, especially white lady teachers, would have trouble controlling their classes with material like this, pointing to the lynching picture, in the book. So our book was going to cause racial unrest. Well, we had pre-tested our book with an overwhelmingly white class and with an overwhelmingly black class, and they both liked it all to pieces better than their book. So we had material for for rebuttal testimony on this point. But we didn't need to use it because at this point, the judge, the 83-year-old white Mississippian, but a man of honor, Orma Smith, I'll call him out, took over the questioning. And he said, and I quote, "But that happened, didn't it? Didn't Mississippi have more lynchings than any other state?" And Turnipseed said, I quote, "Well, yes, but that all happened so long ago. Why dwell on it now?" And the judge said, "Well, it is a history book." And we elbowed each other and said, "We're going to win this case." And we did win it. It was ordered adopted for the usual 6-year period. But that whole escapade taught me that history can be a weapon and that it can be used against you, and it had been used against my students. And I submit in its own way, it also had been used against white students in Mississippi because it made them stupid. It made them toward Dylann Roof, all right? I mean, they didn't all come out Dylann Roofs, not at all, I'm not saying that. But it gave them the ideological support for white supremacy, directly. All right, well, I left Tougaloo after 7 years. I moved to the University of Vermont, but I continued to teach first-year students, which I like, and I continued to be impressed suddenly that it wasn't just Mississippi. My Vermont students, only 40% of whom are from Vermont, the rest of them from all up and down the eastern seaboard, mostly, and even Chicago in places. Well, it was number 3 on Playboy's list of party schools in the US. But anyway, my UVM students, as it's called, they knew the damnedest things about the past that never happened, and they didn't know some of the most important things, 1 or 2 of which I learned today and took notes on, that did happen, all right? And so I came to realize this is not a Mississippi problem. This is not a South Carolina problem. This is a national problem. Mississippi exemplified this problem in a more exaggerated form, as Mississippi exemplified various other problems in a more exaggerated form. I saw some of your photos yesterday. Thank God for Mississippi, because it keeps South Carolina from being 50th, or 48th at the time, whatever. And, but it's a national problem. Well, I want to see if that problem afflicts you. And so I'm going to actually do a little referendum right here, okay? And I'm doing this as a way that you can teach this subject being secession. And the way I get into it, and those of you who aren't going to teach or aren't teaching now, you can maybe think about it and maybe recommend it to people who do teach and use it in various ways in your. I start by asking you all, what's the most, in fact, I will ask you. I'll stop saying what I would do and I'll do it. In the history of the United States, since we formed as a nation, what's the most important single thing that ever happened? Students will be a little more forthcoming than teachers, but still, what is the most important thing? The Vietnam War?
The Civil War.
I like her a lot. Yes, of course, it has to be. I mean, we actually killed more Americans in the Civil War, according to a new count, than in all of our other wars combined, even Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, okay? And you can think about it besides just the death toll, there's about 11 other ways in which it's the most important single thing that ever happened. Okay, so why did we have a civil war? Well, as soon as you say, why did we have a civil war, you should ask, Loewen, didn't we have a civil war because the South seceded? And of course you're right. And so the question really becomes, why did the South secede, right? And I would encourage you to actually let your students answer. And if I had more time in this workshop, I would actually let you all answer. I've done this all across the country. First time I ever did it, I had no idea how it was going to come out. It was in the Greensboro History Museum, which is a big thing. And I was the Dortch lecturer. I thought I was hot stuff because a named lecturer, and I even met Mrs. Dortch, and et cetera. And the room was completely full, and everybody was older than me then. They were about as old as me now, so they were a bunch of old folks that really knew history and stuff. There was an overflow to another room and all kinds of stuff. And I got these 4 answers. The South seceded for slavery. The South seceded for states' rights. The South seceded, where is it? The South seceded because of the election of Lincoln, and the South seceded over issues about tariffs and taxes. And I submit those are the 4 answers you're going to get, okay? Now, I want to do a vote, and I don't want you to talk. I don't want you to collude, so we're not going to have a discussion. Are you ready to vote? You have to be. I'm telling you, you're ready to vote, okay? Now, I want to say this. This is not Chicago. You cannot vote twice, okay? This is only once, okay? Chicago hasn't really been an issue for some decades, but matter of fact, we don't have any voting twice to speak of in the United States. It's whole, never mind. I don't want to get into current politics right now. Okay. Also, I don't want you to abstain. You might say, oh, I can't decide between number 1 and number. Can I get an amen that you're going to vote once and only once? Yeah. Okay. All right. Here we go. The South seceded. What? I think in that case, you should sit at that table. Pick one, damn it. Excuse me. Okay. The South seceded for slavery. Hands up. Yeah, I kind of thought that would happen. All right, the South seceded for states' rights. Hands up. There's a couple people that are putting their hand like this. The South seceded because of the election of Lincoln. 1. The South seceded because of tariffs and taxes or issues thereabouts. One half, okay. I had hoped that would happen, and I'm delighted that it did, okay? I have asked this question of, well, this is how it came out in Greensboro, okay? The next week, I happened to be speaking at St. Cloud State, which is northwest of Minneapolis-St. Paul in Minnesota. You cannot be at a college in the United States and be much further north. You get into this place called Canada, all right? So, just for the heck of it, I asked them. You see how it came out? States' rights won a clear majority. So I asked them in St. Cloud State. It came out just the same. I asked an audience in Cuyahoga County, Ohio, which is Cleveland. Teachers, all teachers, K-12 teachers. Came out just like that. I asked an overwhelmingly black audience, the teaching staff of the Memphis Public Schools. Came out just like that. Long Beach, California, just like that. It's not Orange County. Yeah, it is Orange County, where Disney World is in Florida, just like that. North Dakota, just like that. Within 10 percentage points, and usually even tighter than that, okay? I have now asked thousands and thousands of students, high school students, college students, especially K-12 teachers, and it pretty much comes out like that until 3 years ago. You guys just came out the best that any audience has ever come. Give yourselves a round of applause. You got it right. Right, you can already guess what the right answer is. The right answer being slavery. And what I have, and I'm not going to use it. I didn't know who I'd be speaking to. I didn't know everybody had been here for 3 days. That helps. But some of you already knew it, of course, and I'm not saying you didn't. So I had 3 different places in here to give you the right answer. The key one, and you're in the best state to teach it from, is, of course, this little document. Well, what I do next when I'm teaching this, especially if I'm to students or to K-12 teachers, is I say, let's say it came out this way, because it still comes out this way. For the last 2.5 years, it's been coming out better. For the last 2.5 years, slavery has been winning about 40 to 50%. It's not yet up to a majority, but it is now a plurality. Oh, by the way, the 1% of you, I think it was you, who said Lincoln, you are, of course, also right. And South Carolina says so. It's not an underlying cause, it's a trigger, but it's absolutely correct. Usually, in an audience this size, not one person says it. And in a really audience of 300, 3 people will say it, and they'll feel kind of silly, because ain't but 3 of them, but it's a perfectly good answer. So 1 and 3 were correct, okay? 2 and 4, not at all. And indeed, on states' rights, if you simply read, what I do next is I ask the group, I say, okay, it came out like that. Does that mean states' rights is the right answer? And even though they've just voted for it, they say, well, no. And I say, what do we need? And even if they're middle school, they'll say words like evidence or facts, and that's exactly right? And so then well, like what? Where would you get them? And people say interesting things. So usually they say something really vague, like you might say newspapers. And I say, right, like the Portland Oregonian from 1973. And you'll reply, well, no, how about something from the time? And they're already getting, right in front of your eyes, the concept of primary sources, right? And I say, the Portland, no, how about the South Carolina newspaper, whatever it's called? I do know, but they don't, and why should they, And so we're getting into some good stuff. And of course, the very best evidence, even better than the Post-Courier? Whatever it is in Charleston. The very best is this document, Declaration of the Immediate Causes, you know where I'm going with this, which induce and justify the secession of South Carolina from the federal union. And then I read it to them, parts of it. It starts out with how many of you have read this document? Oh, some of you haven't. All right. Your reading assignment tonight, it's on the web. Read this document. Okay? It starts out with a very interesting 2.5-page constitutional history of the United States that leaves out the Constitution. This is not easy to do, and you can see how they do it. And then they get into why they are seceding. And here's what they say. The Constitution of the United States, in its 4th article, provides as follows. No person held to service or labor in one state, it's the Fugitive Slave Act, right? And then they complain about states that are using states' rights to mess around with that, okay? The states of, and they list them, they list 16 or 17 states beginning with, let's see, where is it? Maine, New Hampshire, blah, 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 down to Michigan, Wisconsin, and Iowa, have enacted laws that either nullify the acts of Congress, So this is directly in favor of the national and against states' rights. Totally wrong then, states' rights. All about slavery. Okay? Nothing about the tariffs and taxes, of course. That was an issue in 1833, 30 to 33, but it was not an issue at all now. The tariff bill had been written by a plantation owner from Virginia in 1853, and nobody in the South had any complaint about it. And they complained about some other things. Now, if you get an answer, white supremacy, which you won't from students, that's the right answer too, because some of the things they complain about don't directly have anything to do with slavery. For example, they're upset with some New England states for letting black folks vote. Well, as those of us who have been at the conference are very aware, who votes in America was a state's right until the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments, 2 whole eras after what we're talking about, right, during Reconstruction. So they're just upset with that because it's letting black folks vote in New Hampshire. It's none of their business who votes in New Hampshire. Black folks had briefly voted in North Carolina, for God's sake, etc. There's more things wrong with this. And there's many other places in here that are very similar as to that it's all about slavery. Well, we have to teach this. We have to teach this right, and we have to not teach it that way. But if people say white supremacy, that's fine, because they do, in this document and in some other things, make it clear that slavery is a tool to maintain white supremacy. But the key issue is maintaining white supremacy. And this does that too, okay? And this is the famous second national flag, the main flag of the Confederacy. That is the battle flag of the Army of Northern Virginia. But the National Confederacy is this white thing, and it was specifically white to stand for white folks and the purity and racial supremacy of white folks. And the guy who proposed it is this William Thompson guy, and we have here 2 letters by him that propose it, and he wins. And the third flag, which they only had for about a couple months, is that same flag, but they put a red stripe on the right-hand side because in the last few months of the Confederacy, first of all, they were surrendering a lot. And second of all, this looks like a flag of surrender if the wind isn't blowing. So they put a red stripe on it, but they still maintain the white deliberately. And it comes back again, you see. The Confederate flag this is 1951, this bottom thing here, the symbol of the white race and the cause of the white people. Well, okay, so then if your group answers like this, then you might want to ask them, after you show them, after you get them even to read the documents and stuff, and they see, holy poopy, we were really wrong, then the question comes about, why does this happen? Why do people in Cleveland, why do people in Memphis, why do people maybe in the room you're teaching in, answer like this? How can this be? Because the evidence is utterly clear. There's no debate about this. It's not like it's kind of about states' rights. It's clearly against states' rights. And so then you get into how come we're wrong. And then you get into the concept of historiography. How many of you know the term historiography? Can I see your hands? Should I teach it to the rest? I'll tell you what. You had your hand up. You made the mistake of having your hand up. What is historiography? Kind of. Did you hear her? Okay. What other historians have said about the same topic? That'll do. The simplest way to define it is maybe the study of history, but not in the sense of, oh, I'm way behind, I got to do historiography this weekend. Rather, the study of the writing of history. You know, how come this history is written this way? Who wrote this? Who didn't write it? When was it written? That kind of thing. So you can get students then into thinking about those issues. And I use this. This is from my book, Lies Across America. For that book, I read every historical marker in the U.S., just about, at least every state one. And this is the most beautiful of them all. This is a piece of slate carved into the shape of the state of Idaho. And look what it says. Dedicated to the memory of those who lost their lives in the most horrible Indian massacre, 1861. 300 immigrants westbound. Only 5 escaped. I submit every historic site, every historic text, every historic movie, novel, textbook, source, every historic source is a tale of at least 2 eras. It's a tale of what it's about, right? And it's a tale of when it went up, in the case of a historical marker, or when it was filmed, in the case of a movie, or whatever. And it's also maybe a tale of today, too, if you think about it, but certainly at least those first two. And the reason I teach that from this is because it turns out that 300 people in their little wagon train were not killed in southern Idaho in 1860. 30 were not. 3 were not. It never happened at all. And I know this because an excellent Western historian, Brigham Madsen, dedicated 10 years of his life to proving, it's not easy to prove a negative, but he proved that this did not and could not possibly have happened. And he nails it. And so this is one of the entries in my book, Lives Across America. And in fact, the Idaho State Historical Association agrees with me and Madsen, and they want Almo, Idaho to take it down. But Almo won't take it down because it's the biggest thing that ever happened in Almo, even though it never happened. Okay? And you can see they've got it decorated here for Christmas. Interesting concept. Well, so that gets people into thinking that there's twice as much to learn about for every single historic source, not just what it's about, but also when it went up. Okay? And so the concept of historiography is crucial. I've taught it to 5th graders. I know you can teach it to 5th graders. Certainly high school and middle school students can learn it just fine. And they become so smart. It helps them be, you were asking a question, how about becoming a critical reader? And that's a very key question. And historiography is one of the key ways to cause that to happen. Okay? And so we're doing it when we ask, how did we get to this position where people are actually answering states' rights for this question? When did this start happening? Well, it really started happening during the nadir of race relations, which we have had some discussion of, and I'm really happy that we have, during this conference. And I'm going to actually speed up because I want to hear, well, we're going to have a break, and also I want to hear Vernon's, he's going to do a shtick later on. So I'm not going to belabor this point. I'm going to show you a couple of pictures of the nadir. I want to say this. During the nadir, things got worse and worse in terms of race relations. 3 things happened in 1890 so that we have to define the nadir as beginning in that year. It doesn't have to be defined as ending in 1940, but I think that's best. But you can, other dates are fine. But 3 things happened at the end of 1890. First of all, what used to be called the Battle at Wounded Knee, now it's more accurately the Massacre at Wounded Knee, and Native people go into their nadir for sure. Second of all, Mississippi passes its new constitution, and it's blatantly unconstitutional. It's completely opposite to the 14th and 15th Amendment, and they're blatantly obvious about it. There's only one thing really wrong with the 1868 Constitution, and that is that it lets black folks be citizens, and that's what they're taking care of illegally. But the United States does nothing. And of course, seeing this, then Alabama follows suit, South Carolina, states even as far away as Oklahoma in 1907. And the third thing that happens is the United States Senate fails to pass, more or less by 1 vote, the Federal Elections Act of that year, which is kind of like the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It's not as good, but it's not a bad act. Passed the House, would have been signed into office by Republican President Benjamin Harrison, but it fails in the Senate by 1 vote. And now I'm going to use the N word here, in case you need a trigger for it. I'm going to use it because I'm quoting the people who used it. After they defeated it, the Democrats, as was their wont, characterized the Republicans, saying, you people ain't nothing but a bunch of nigger lovers. In the past, the Republicans had replied, you're damn right. Somebody has to stand up for these people. It's an outrage what you're doing every fall election in the South, and also what you're doing to white Republicans. But in 1891, they made a new response, and their new response was, no, we aren't. Remember the charge? No, we aren't. And they move on to other issues. And black folks are without political allies. It doesn't happen just at once then, but it kind of does then. And then other events through the 1890s solidify it for sure. And so the nadir sets in. From then on, the white South, and we got to not just say the white South because there are whites who didn't think this way, but so let's call it what it is. The white neo-Confederate South tells the story of Reconstruction nationally, and of course across the South. And the North lets them do it because the North moves into white supremacy too. And we see it in all kinds of ways. I got a whole bunch of ways about how to teach the nadir. And in fact, we're already mired in the middle of teaching secession right now. But I want to suggest that the last chapter of this book is how to teach the nadir. And we should, or nadir, some people say that's fine, N-A-D-I-R. It's a word, means low point. The nadir, it's the opposite of zenith, okay. And it is perhaps the most important thing to teach that we are not now teaching. We do teach it in the form of, we do mention Jim Crow. But Jim Crow is usually limited to a discussion of public accommodations, theaters and such across the South. The nadir is national. It is a complete retreat from the anti-racist idealism of Reconstruction, which was also national, okay? Not just, Reconstruction is this ideological movement as well as the literal political reconstruction of the southern states. And so we see things happening like, for instance, Harvard College stops letting black folks live in the dormitories. University of Minnesota stops letting black people live in the dormitories, 1930 or so. I can tell you things that actually make me cry just to tell them almost. The concept of fireman on the railroad, not a person who builds fires, the person who keeps the steam engines going. Fireman was kind of a black job on southern railroads, and even railroads like the Illinois Central, which goes from Mississippi up to Chicago. But there's during the Depression, the 1930s Depression, the Great Depression, it became a white job across the North and even into the South, because it's a job, right? I mean, it's a nasty job. It's a hard job, but it's a job, and we need jobs in the Depression. And so the Firemen's Union actually set up a bounty of $200 to $300 if you would shoot and kill or injure a black fireman. And they paid it 13 times. That's how bad race relations got. Well, I'll show you some pictures of the nadir. I've got another slide first. I'll skip it. There's a picture from the nadir. That is the lynching picture that Turnipseed objected to, okay? And it's a key picture of a lynching, to be not from Mississippi at all, it's from Omaha. But the key element of a lynching is a public murder, I'm defining it now, a public murder done with considerable support of the community. And you can literally see that support, right? A bunch of well-dressed men and women are happily being photographed while committing a felony. And that's what gets across the key, and so we get students thinking about that. A lot of students think a lynching has to be hanging. It doesn't. This man, of course, is being burned to death. It doesn't have to be a black folks. 2/3 of the victims were black, but some victims were white, especially in the West. Some victims were Chinese or Mexican American, etc. Or a famous Jewish case in Georgia, and so on. And that shows the public support. So and it's not a gruesome picture. I mean, some of the pictures are, shall we say, tasteless. I can't imagine I'm calling that a tasteful picture, but today, not one state history textbook has ever shown a picture of a lynching, except ours. Today, not one single United States history has a picture of a lynching. Isn't this an outrage? You know? I mean, fifth graders can handle it. Fifth graders, I've taught fifth graders these pictures. They do fine. Sometimes the parents don't. But, this is my favorite picture of the nadir, if you can imagine a favorite picture of this terrible era. What do you see? I taught this to a bunch of fifth graders. No, it's a funny story, but it's too long, so I won't tell it to you. When I first taught it to fifth graders, I asked them, what do you see? And they said, well, he looks about 5 years old and he's whipping that black man. They didn't understand can you read the caption? Get up, uncle, okay? And I trust you guys know, but if you don't, and they didn't, the man is not the boy's uncle, of course. Uncle was a term of quasi-respect that we used for older and more senior African Americans during the nadir. We wouldn't want to say Mr. or Sir, because that implies they're fully human, right? So we said uncle, or if they're female, aunt or auntie. And I point out we still have these terms today, right? Uncle Ben's rice, Aunt Jemima pancake syrup, and people they don't know that. And the reason it's my favorite picture of the nadir is because the cream of wheat people, as you can read down there, in 1914 think this would make most Americans feel happy inside, and they'd rush out and buy their cereal. And they probably know their market, right? So these kinds of things get across to students what we're dealing with. I want to show you something about Confederate monuments. I think that it's appropriate for people in South Carolina, even teachers, to address the issue of Confederate monuments. I think Confederate monuments help produce Dylan Roof. Confederate monuments mess us all up in our minds. I have a chapter in Lies Across America about Confederate monuments. It's actually my Montana chapter, because would you believe, in Helena, Montana, the United Daughters of the Confederacy put up a beautiful fountain to our beloved Confederate dead. I didn't know that the Confederacy ever held Montana. Matter of fact, the United States didn't hold Montana. This guy named George Armstrong Custer had a little Indian problem in Montana 15 years after the Civil War started, but that didn't stop the good old folks from the UDC from putting up this. Well, incidentally, that monument came down last year, finally, okay, from Helena. Well, this is a typical Confederate monument before the nadir, okay? Most of them go up in cemeteries. This one didn't. It's actually not typical, but it has a couple of typical characteristics. Would you call this triumphant? What are you seeing? How would you describe it? How would you describe it? Sad, pensive, reflective, something like that. Certainly not triumphant, right? My example here is the state of Kentucky. I pointed this out in the monument session, but I'll say it again. How many of you heard me talk about Kentucky? Can remember it? Well, I'll say it real quick. Kentucky didn't secede. Kentucky sent 3 times more people to the U.S. Army than it did to the CS Army. Okay? Kentucky wound up now with, or a few years ago, with 74 Civil War monuments. 2 of them are for the U.S. and 72 are for the Confederates. Okay? And in my chapter in Lies Across America, I quote, I refer to what difference this makes. It's a lot easier to have a Confederate heart if you have a Confederate landscape. And you are inflicted in South Carolina with a Confederate landscape in almost every county, okay? And they need to go away. They need to go into a nadir park, or you need to do something interesting with them. And so I suggest you want to get students thinking about this. And I want to see white students thinking about this, not just black students thinking about this. We white folks need to get some alternative heroes, even white folks like the guy you mentioned, the guy you showed the photograph of. He needs a historical marker, you know? He's a great man. And then we have this BS about states' rights. And I showed you this earlier. Some of you remember it, namely that it was for states' rights. Well, in 1965, when this monument goes up at Gettysburg, South Carolina is in favor of states' rights. They want it's run by white people, and they want the right to run their own schools without desegregating them, and want the right to run their own polls without letting black folks vote, and they don't want no Voting Rights Act, etc. So in a sense, this is accurate for 1965, but it's complete BS for 1863 in the case of Gettysburg. States' rights was not their credo here. We've already seen that they were seceding because they were mad at states' rights. They were against states' rights. So South Carolina needs to put up a historical marker right in front of this at Gettysburg, saying, we put this up in 1965, here's why we did it, here's what's wrong with it, we're sorry we did it, we're going to leave it up to show you what idiots we were, but now we're on the right track, you know? Well, you could write that, you could rephrase that, maybe. All right, what's the effect of this lie being how the vote comes out everywhere but in this room, okay? This idiotic lie about states' rights and about tariffs. Well, it makes everybody stupid, but I want to focus on number 2 and number 5, okay? Number 2, it minimizes the role of African Americans. I mean, if the South seceded for states' rights, what's that got to do with black folks? Nothing, right? Heck, anybody who's had any trouble with the IRS, I count myself in that group once, is kind of in favor of states' rights or thinks the IRS is kind of big, or, you know, it's a vaunted cause. We're rebels, small r. Oh, that's really good. All right. So it does that. It minimizes. In fact, you can see that the role of African Americans is a big cause of secession because white folks, white Confederates, about to be Confederates, white supremacists, are really upset by fugitive slaves for 2 reasons. First of all, it's an economic disaster for them. Slaves were worth half as much in Maryland as they were in Mississippi because it's easy for them to escape. It's as simple as that. So it's an economic loss even if your slave didn't escape. And second of all, we white folks are talking to, you know, racism. Oh, here, I've got to talk about this just for a minute. We have to strap on the R word and we have to teach about racism. And we have to do it in a way that doesn't upset white folks. There's no white person in your class, there's no white person at Clemson, even people as old as me, who was a slave owner, right? It's not their fault. We're not doing anything about guilt. We're not doing anything about shame on the other side. And we maybe need to talk about that just directly. One way to do this, if you're a white teacher and you have an overwhelmingly black class, I suggest you say, some people tell me that overwhelmingly black class cannot have the maturity to talk about slavery or secession or whatever, especially with a white teacher. And they will. It causes them to have twice as much maturity. I invented this idea. This is the only teaching idea I invented, actually, so I want to brag about it. It relates to this picture. The very first time that I was going to teach 5th grade, I was brought in to teach a very diverse class. It was all of the 5th graders are going to teach. The first one was like you guys, some of you have to go to work really early, like 7:35 in the morning or something was the first 5th grade class. Next one was 8:25 and then 9:15 and so on. And finally it ended at 3 o'clock or whenever it ended. And by that time I would have taught the whole 5th grade, right? And the assistant principal who brought me said to me before I started, "Now, Jim, what are you going to do with these kids?" That's an exact quote. And meaning she was worried. So, anyway, maybe she had reason to be. And I said, I was all excited. And back then we had these things called, what's they're called? Visuals of overheads. Overhead. And I had this, and I had the lynching picture, and a bunch of other pictures. I said, well, I'm going to show them these pictures. And her face fell, and she said, "Oh, Jim, do you have to?" And of course, after that, I did have to. And so I did. But I prefaced it at the first class. I was a little worried. I had never taught 5th grade before. I said to them at the beginning of the first class, I said, "Now some people tell me," I didn't say it was your assistant principal, "some people tell me that 5th graders are not mature enough to handle what I'm about to show you." That's all I said. What do you think happened? They were twice as mature as you or me. They handled it just fine. And in fact, in particular, I showed them this picture. And after I showed them this picture, I explained to them, I took them through Uncle. I asked them to describe it. And then I got the discussion going by saying this question. I said, "Now, imagine that you're that little boy, but you're no longer 5 years old, you're now 45 years old. It's 40 years later. You're going to come upon this picture because you're going through stuff and your grandma's at it. What's your reaction?" I had no idea what I was going to get. And the little boy sitting right about where you were, a little white boy, said, I quote him, he said, "Ooh, what was I thinking?" 4 words and an ooh, and I submit he nailed it. Okay? And we went on from there. At the end of the day, the assistant principal comes and she says to me, and she puts her hand on me like this, "How did it go?" Meaning, what disaster do I have to clean up tomorrow at this school of mine? And I told her that story, and she said, "I knew they could handle it." I think I'm going to stop there. Oh, well, anyway, so you can do that in terms of handling the race issue. Maybe you're a black teacher and you've got a 50-50 class, and then you say, some people tell me that a mixed class like this, especially with a black teacher, can't discuss stuff like slavery. They're just not mature enough. I use the word mature. That's not quite the issue with an interracial, but they will do it fine. They will do it fine. They will handle it great. Okay. Well, let me finish up. Oh, I wanted to talk about number 5. You all need to know this. This is very important, I think. In every school system I've ever taught in except one, that being the Department of Defense schools, which is interesting, but every other school system, there's a gap between white folks and black folks, also between white folks and Native Americans, if there are any, in every school subject. The gap is the smallest in math. It's bigger in English, but it is by far the biggest in history or social studies. Could that be because history is harder than, say, Faulkner or trigonometry? I don't think so. I think it's because of how history is usually taught. I think we teach it white. I think some of us, even who are black teachers, are still teaching it white because we're in a white culture and we haven't got, I think I teach some stuff white. We got to work on it, all right? And so we need to just say that openly. And this stuff this idiotic notion that secession is about states' rights helps cause number 5, I think. Well, I did that already. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to close really right now by saying the only complaint that I really get when I do a workshop, and I've done, school systems hire me all the time. I just did a workshop. The last workshop I did for a school system was an American Indian school system. But before then, I did a workshop for a big city that's a suburb of Sacramento. And I've done several workshops in Florida, in huge school systems in Florida, and so on. And the only complaint I ever get is that I emphasize the bad stuff. I don't actually think that's true. I certainly don't think Reconstruction's the bad stuff, do you? I mean, Reconstruction's one of the shining moments of our history, really. But I submit to you, what we need is patriotism, not nationalism. And here I am waving the flag on purpose. And I take my definition of patriotism from this guy named Frederick Douglass. I think you've heard of him. Forgive him his sexism in this next statement. He was terrific on women's rights, actually. But this is how everybody wrote in America until about 30 years ago. He said, I call him a true patriot who rebukes his country for its sins and does not excuse them. Okay? And I submit to you, we need that kind of patriotism. Now, a nationalist on the other side says, what sins? We don't got no sins. And if you think we do, I'm going to hit you upside the head with this book. And they hit you upside the head with the mess of American history textbook, which averages 1,152 pages. I know because I counted them. All right? So I submit to you, nationalism is not patriotic. Nationalism is not what we need. Nationalism makes us stupider. Okay? And that teaching the truth about the past is patriotic. Let's take a break. Thank you for your attention.
Vernon asked me to go ahead and get started. I just kind of put myself on the program. I'm not on the program. You all heard me introduce myself this morning. I'm a professor at USC Upstate, and I got my master's degree here, and I was actually coming down here to hear my advisor talk. Then I was asked to run a session, and then I was like, well, are you going to stay here for this? And I was going to go home because I need a grade, but then he asked me to stay over, so I did. And after listening, I think I have a little bit to kind of make some remarks from the front lines of teacher preparation, and I just kind of want to leave you with that. So at Upstate, we have a relationship with the School of Ed. Students get an education degree, and we provide the content. One of the most recent revisions we just did is that most of these students take the senior seminar course. They don't know how to write a major research paper, so they whine and complain if somebody really tries to make them do it the right way. So they've replaced one of the other courses in that curriculum with our methods course. But I teach courses that are required for different constituencies. As I said, we have a U.S. history course since 1865. Elementary ed and middle grades have to take that, and I try to get as many of those students as possible because I teach this course on an AP U.S. history format because I kind of want the students to have deep knowledge of that. All of the classes I teach, if I'm teaching a class like that, I infuse it with diversity, race, gender, class, that whole intersectional approach. I also teach South Carolina history. If you're going to teach 3rd grade or 8th grade, you have to have South Carolina history. I made sure as soon as the guy who retired from teaching South Carolina history left that I got that course because I was missing a lot of the teachers. When I got there, because we had never had a permanent African Americanist at USC Upstate. It was kind of like the defense against the dark arts. Everybody who got the job didn't stay. So I've been there for 20 years. I'm the first one there who stayed, and I got tenured and promoted. So when the Africanists left, because under the Education Improvement Act of 1984, they were required to learn about Africa or African American experience, and I really didn't see what Africa could offer students from South Carolina, but as long as he was there, I couldn't blast that course out. So as soon as he left, I pushed my way in, and I have that course as well. So I see education majors 3 times. Both of my kids graduated from South Carolina schools. My oldest graduated magna from Carolina. She's in the MFA program at the University of Southern California in interactive media. My youngest is a junior at University of Southern California. I am broke, so like they have scholarships, so I'm not paying for that. Don't think getting a history degree is going to make you really rich or anything. So they're both out in California. But one of the things I wanted as a parent was I wanted to be sure that the people who taught my children were going to be well prepared for what they did. And even though my kids are no longer in those schools, I feel an obligation to make sure that every student who is taught in those public schools is taught in a way that I did. Because I tell you what I do not like. I do not like it when I get students who arrive at my school thinking like the students that Jim Loewen talked about. And so I spend a lot of my time in what you might call re-education, and trying to get students to see things different ways and trying to break down some of these kind of fixed rules that, you know, when you have a coach teach you in high school, and a lot of these students do. So I make clear, look, I'm not a coach. And when I have these coaches coming through my classes wanting to just slide through so they can go out and get their job because somebody's going to give them a job in the school so they can coach, I put the hammer down because that's not what our children deserve. One of the things I would say when I was listening to what Jim was talking about, thinking about the challenges of being an educator, is confirmation bias. And so, you know, whenever I teach Civil War, I haven't taught Civil War in a couple of years, because every time I teach it, when I first go in there, it's full of white guys. No matter how many kids it is, most of them are white. When we get to the Declaration of Causes, they gotta go. They won't deal with that. I had students, the last time I taught this course, one had a B+, one had a B, and they both dropped, because one of them came to me and said something like, I can still argue states' rights something about an assignment. I said, well, if that's what the documents say, and I knew that wasn't what the document said. So that's another thing you have to think about as an educator and when you're teaching students, is about confirmation bias. And I think one of the big challenges is we have to recognize that sometimes certain kind of mythologies are very crucial to our students' identity. So like when I'm teaching African American history, a lot of times my Black students won't consider certain types of ideas because they are, you know, they understand slavery in some kind of construct of just about race, and they don't want to look at those complexities. I also learned this semester it's probably not a good idea to show Amistad that much, because when I showed Amistad, my Black students, I turned the lights on and some of them just shut down because I showed the scene on the slave ship where, you know, they kidnapped them and they were beating them to show terror. I paired this with Die Hard. And I start out with Die Hard because the point of Die Hard is, okay, these people they've been free, but these guys come in with all of these guns blazing and stuff like that, and watch how obedient these people come. So I try to teach them about slavery being a system of terror, not by just using stuff where African Americans are victimized, but showing that, you know, submission is not necessarily a weakness. Sometimes it's a survival strategy, and it's certainly human nature. So one of the things that I would say, you know, when you teach, I also recognize that some of my students might have issues with race. And sometimes they might have issues with me as an African-American woman, and I try to diffuse that. Sometimes I'm light and I'm comedic. I try to mix my personality because I do have bitchy resting face, and sometimes that makes people think I'm mean. I mean, I've had, I don't know how many white males come to me this semester from education. Dr. Harris, I heard everybody over in the education school is saying you were so mean, but you're not that mean. You're just really hard. And so all of this, I'm serious. This has happened to me several times, and then they tell me, and I don't know if it's to get brownie points, I went back over and I told the people in School of Education that you're really good. You just want us to be good. So it's all of that kind of stuff. So you have all of these challenges, and you know, teaching in a Black body, and I don't really kind of consciously think of myself as I'm teaching. I don't perceive myself as teaching while Black. I see myself as being a historian at that moment. I don't use we when I'm talking about African Americans. I'm not inclusive, I'm exclusive. I talk about them and they regardless of who it is, and try to encourage my students to do the same, because when you start talking about we, Whether you're talking about American history, whether you're talking about Southern history, you have an investment in the outcome. And once you get an investment in the outcome, that's going to limit the possibilities of your historical critical thinking. You're not going to think about people that make your group look bad. And so it's very important for us to take a remote space away from our historical topics, because that's the only way we can really kind of dig deep and dig past things that make us feel safe and start to understand the multiple complexities that have kind of undergirded where we are as a country. And you know, I try to teach my classes where all of my students feel like they can express whatever they want to express. And I do use the N-word too sometimes, Jim, and I warn the triggers coming, and I tell everybody, nobody can use it but me. So, because I know how to wield it, it's like a dangerous weapon, and I'm the only one who can wield it, so I don't let anybody else wield it in my class. But I think that that's something that's really important, to kind of level that playing field when you have mixed race students, to let Black students know they aren't the authority on slavery, and white students know they aren't the authority on white experience. I'm the authority, because I had 20 graduate courses and I wrote a 713-page PhD dissertation. And when you get to that point, you can tell me something, but until then, y'all are on the same plane. And that's something very important, that when you can kind of put it like that and not give any of the students that a kind of authority or supremacy on the topic, I think it makes it go better. Sometimes I try to make myself the enemy of the entire class so that they can kind of come together in opposition to me. But those are the kinds of tactics you can use. You got to be open, and you got to be willing to have difficult conversations, because I think that's really how things change. And I really wish I could have come to more of this conference, but USC Upstate is a teaching university, and I have 5 classes this term and 2 night class senior seminar. My senior seminar, and I'll talk about that, then I'll sit down because I'm taking Amanda's time, but my senior seminar class this term is about South Carolina in the antebellum period. So I'm having a student, she presented on the domestic cadaver trade in South Carolina. They hate, why won't you let us do anything other than South Carolina? Because I said. So she did something on use of Black bodies in medical experimentation in South Carolina. I had a white male who wanted to do something on cotton, and he really wanted to rewrite Lacey Ford and Rachel Klein. And I just kind of said, you're not doing that. And so he finally, learned to do something that he could do. So he's talking about diffusion of cotton. I have one doing something on the Charleston Orphan House, one on Graniteville Mill, and what else? One did one on white female education in antebellum, South Carolina, which was really interesting. And I've got a couple doing stuff on, one is on slave resistance and one is on slave discipline. So, I mean, you can get students, and most of these students, all but 2 of the students I have are white. And they're doing some really complex work. And I think the way that we educate students is we put that material in their hands, like Jim said. We guide them, because it can be, it's a complex situation. So we do need to guide them to where they need to go sometimes. But I think, primary sources, using primary sources, having them confront that evidence for themselves as much as possible is probably the best technique I do. I do primary source analysis in all of my courses at all levels. I grade a lot, which is why I'm getting ready to leave, because I got a lot of papers at home I got to grade. But those kinds of things are educational benefits, so that students can kind of learn the power of creating history and understanding how who holds history sometimes results in the stories that history tells. And I'm done. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So as you guys know, my name is Amanda Arroyo, and I thought that it might be best if I start. First of all, can you guys hear me? Awesome. If I gave a little bit of background about myself, and I think that might help explain the things I'm going to say a little bit better. So like Dr. Burton says, I am a Latina. I was born in Valencia, Venezuela, and I moved to the United States when I was 6 years old. I moved in, I believe it was early March, to Syracuse, New York. If you guys don't know anything about New York, Syracuse, New York is like the snowiest, coldest, most just opposite of tropic weather that you can get in the world, right? So I remember distinctly my little brother, who at the time was like, he was like 3, right? Alberto was like, okay, my brother was 2. And he turns to my mom literally as we get off the plane to move to New York, and he goes, Mom, what's this white grass? Because obviously, like, you know, Syracuse, New York, we're in 3 feet of snow 90% of the time. So, but the interesting thing was that when I went to my school, the kids there were really surprised. You know, they were really surprised. They're like, wow, but like, you don't look like what we expected you to look like. You know, mind you, these are 6-year-old kids, right? And so from a very young age, I had kind of understood that I was living in a double world, right? So I was living in the world of my cultural identity as a Venezuelan girl, now woman, with my family, right? So I would go home and we would have arepas. We would have, you know, hallacas at Christmas time, which are all Venezuelan food, so don't worry about it. But then, you know, I would come to school and the lunchroom was like the worst place in the world for me. Because I'm like, wait, who do I sit with? Like, which group do I belong to, right? I'm not quite Hispanic enough to like sit with the Hispanic people, but I'm also not quite white enough to sit with the white kids. And so, like, you know, it became kind of a little weird identity crisis for me. And this honestly got worse when I moved to South Carolina. You know, I was a little bit older. I was about 10 years old when I moved to South Carolina, and the racial lines, especially I could tell from an early age, were a lot more divided. You know, it was a lot more distinct of you sat with who you looked like, which again brought the problem to my attention. Where do I go? Where do I belong, right? And luckily, you know, I've always been somebody who is very outgoing. I like to talk, like, probably a little too much sometimes, but, you know, so I can make friends quick. But, you know, having that immediate group of friends and group of people to be able to relate to, I can imagine would be really nice. So what I'm here to talk to you guys about is about how we can discuss this type of stuff in the classroom. You know, here in Clemson, I did my undergraduate here, and I'm doing my master's here. And the entire time, I have been very, very active in the community, in the Hispanic community, and I've been very, very active with education. You know, for about 3 years, I was a tutor for the academic services for the athletic department, which I don't know if you guys know anything about the shelf life of a tutor. That is like dinosaur age. So I've been around that education for a minute, and one of the things that has maintained in my personal experience and in the experience that I've had with teaching, and now that I'm a TA and I'm a TA for Pan-African Studies, for Intro to Pan-African Studies. So it's like Dr. Bartley, and then a predominantly black class, and then like the tiny white girl in the corner who nobody knows is Hispanic because my name's Amanda. So one of the things that I would like to challenge you guys as educators of somebody, you know, of kids in a climate now where everything is seen quickly on social media, and, you know, people are able to see this information and things that happen now a lot quicker, is I want to challenge you guys to think about those identities as you guys teach history or teach current events and stuff like that, right? We can't think of history, especially during the civil rights movement, as just black and white anymore. We have to think about those intersections of society that are really important, you know? And this is not to take away from the struggle of the black community at all. One of the first things I did when Dr. Burton asked me to speak today is I said, okay, what do I do so I don't take away from the struggle of the black community when I'm talking about being more inclusive? And like I said, I like to talk. So I called up one of my friends who is a public school teacher in Baltimore. and who is very socially active, and who is, somebody who, if I could talk to a room of people who I want to know what you want to know. So I talked to her. I was like, Ronnie, what can I say to better help further what I think is a greater amount of inclusivity, but also not say something that's going to be negative towards the Black community. And basically what she told me is to do what I've been doing here in the last couple of minutes, to let you guys know that it's important that whenever you guys teach, it's important that you say, there was a general struggle, but it's also important that you note that the struggle for example, Black women was different. And there was also a struggle going on at the same time for Hispanic people and for Asian people during the same time that these things were happening, and to encourage your students to look into these things. To teach them those critical thinking skills where you are. So critical thinking doesn't just have to be necessarily a skill that you're taught, well, this is how you think critically. It's something that you can teach on the fly, right? You can say, well, okay, why do you think that happened? Okay, well, prove it to me. And one of the things that I find that lights a student's eyes up more than anything in the world is when you challenge them to teach you something about themselves. So I know that so y'all see me up here, I'm tiny, right? I'm wearing heels, but I'm 5'2". So I'm 5'2", and when you put me up against an offensive lineman and are like, all right, teach this guy, it can be a little difficult sometimes to have authority and just be like, no, and they're at the end of the day, they're gonna do what they wanna do, but when you engage them and you say, all right, tell me a little bit about yourself. And he says, I'm from Bluffton, right? You're like, all right, that's cool. So let's talk a little about Bluffton. Tell me what you think. Tell me something that you know. What inspires you? What about there is, what are you interested in? And that's when you see his eyes just get real big, and he goes, well, blah, 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 blah. I don't know anything about Bluffton. That was a really bad example. Sorry, guys. But just, engage your students and make sure that you are aware of all of the other parts of history that are now being, brought to the forefront. Don't be afraid to talk about, LGBT. Don't be afraid to talk about, race. Don't be afraid to talk about any of that stuff, because at the end of the day, I find that most of your students want to know. Most of them are interested in kind of in a selfish way. Our professor, the director of our graduate department, tells us that, when we study history and when we pick what we want to study, it's because we want to explore something about ourselves. And I think that's ultimately true to what happens pretty much in everyone's education when it comes to these, when you study the world around you, whether it be history or, sociology that has intermixes a lot of times, or anything, or the studies of society. So I think that's it. So yeah.
I'm going to open up the question. Time got away from us. I really want us to have some little workshops and things. I know Jim loves that, and the give and take as well, and Bobby. But they gave us so many good things to think about, and if you want to address something to Carmen, you're going to have to call her in Spartanburg or ask Amanda. So let me open it up to the questions.
Right, so when you talk about Latino, right, you're talking about somebody from Latin America. Example, somebody from Brazil can be Latino, Latinx, not Hispanic, right? So that's the first kind of thing I wanted to separate. Now, when we're talking about Latino versus Latinx, that is a current movement to kind of, so I don't know if you've studied Spanish or if any of you guys have studied Spanish or French or any Romance language. A lot of times, most languages, separate things by gender. And the default gender for most things is masculine. right? So when you have a set of all feminine things, they use a feminine ending. If they have a set of like masculine things, they use masculine ending. But if they have a set of all feminine things plus one masculine thing, they use a masculine ending. So the term Latinx is a kind of a way to try to make things more gender neutral in the understanding that in our current time, gender is now a fluid thing. You know, gender is now understood as something more fluid, as something that, you know, not all people necessarily identify with. So that's just a term to try to be respectful and to try to be aware of the changing, basically, that term in society. My suggestion is to use the term that feels most comfortable to you. And if somebody corrects you, just, you know, go with it and move on.
I have a question. Yeah. So I teach a survey USC course, which is what I've taught in my career, and so we're teaching from Jamestown to Obama, essentially. And so one thing I wrestle with, especially at a conference like this, where there's so much great content that I want to now teach, the question I'm asking myself, my background is economics, is what's the trade-off? What am I not teaching? So I'm kind of curious to people who've spoken, what would you say is like, let's talk less about Polk and more about Malcolm X? I don't know.
I meant to say, and you gave me a chance just now, I meant to say that, right at the beginning of my talk, you don't want to teach the textbook. Your job is not to teach the textbook. Your job is to teach history. And you can use the textbook when it's appropriate. I actually counted the number of pages in these textbooks. In the first batch of textbooks, for the first edition of Life in the Physical, they averaged 888 pages, which is absurdly long. It was appropriate in 1960 when we didn't have any other resources that were in a little town, out from Abbeville. There's no library, there's no high school library. But now everybody's got the web, we've got the Library of Congress, we've got Civil War sources, we've got all kinds of stuff. So I think what we need is a 300-page paperback, and I wish South Carolina would adopt one as an alternative. The school that the state could supply them cheaply to give the students, as they now loan the students is huge. And they went from 888 pages, they are now 1,152 pages. They got longer. Who would have thought it possible? So you can't teach all that stuff. You can't cover it, and if you do cover it, you're not uncovering anything, you're not discovering anything, you're just covering it over. So you can't do it. So I think you all who teach K-12 or who teach people who do, you need to have 30 to 50 topics that you think are crucial, that you think nobody should graduate high school without thinking about. Because they're not going, most of them are never going to get this report after they leave high school. All right? And you got now, if this cannot be totally idiosyncratic, if you don't have the Civil War and its impact, you've got an incompetent list. If you don't have the Constitution and its use, you've got an incompetent list. I said this, though, in talking to about 400 Minnesota teachers years ago. What about the national bank issue, under Andrew Jackson? Now, that would not be on my list, partly because I don't really have a thorough grasp of it. But it would be absolutely relevant to the financial crisis of the Great Recession and to today's issues about the Federal Reserve and all kinds of things. So that's an absolutely good thing, and if you understand it and are excited about it, then you should teach it. I do think that something else that happens in that Jackson study has to be on everybody's list, but not necessarily from that presidency. And that's the issue of Indian removal. Right? We don't have to teach the church. That's the easiest one because of some of the stories. But one of my Minnesota teachers said, I don't want to teach that. I don't want to teach the so-called Sioux uprising or the Code of War. Happens right in my part of Minnesota. I said, of course, you do that. Because she's excited. So every one of these 30, I actually made a list for myself after I was playing 30, 50 years. And I made a list, I came up with 37 and a half. It would be on my list. The half is one I'm not sure if I want or not. And so you make up your own list. All of you make up your own list. And every one of them needs to be something you're excited about. Now, if you're you think has some relevance to today, and you don't have to tell the students, okay, you people, here's the relevance of the Cherokee removal to today. Write this down. You can get them to think about what is the relevance of it, they can do the work. But if it doesn't have any relevance to daily human, teach something else. Right? So you're not just looking for different. And then meanwhile, while we're focusing on
something back on the screen.
I want you to walk through chapter 11. That's the chapter that talks about reconstruction. It talks about the national bank. We're going to get something about it. But we're going to focus on this so you can fit. That doesn't fully answer your question because when you guys say focus on the leader, which you never even, you never even heard of before today, and now you think it should be one of the 30 to 50. Just for the record, I think it should. Supervisors is overwhelming and it causes sundown towns all across the United States. Because people can get the session wrong all across the United States. Even right now, it's got a dead hand on it. So I think it should be fun.
You see if you get home.
You are now the
Can we pack up the things? And I know Virginia would do that.
And then there's the issue of push, advanced placement. Some places, advanced placement, instead of teaching 3,000 twigs, I call them twigs, we're not teaching the forest or the twigs, we're teaching twigs. In fact, teaching 3,000 twigs, since it's advanced placement, we'll teach 6,000 twigs. No. There's lots of people who teach advanced placement. Just like I said, 30 to 50 topics with emotion, with excitement, and their students get 4s and 5s.
And actually, APUSH has moved to that, where there's like, here are 5 types of, removals of Indians. Talk about one of them. We'll ask a question in a way that you can
You're all set then.
Yeah, they've moved in that direction. Yeah.
That's my answer. I don't know.
It reminds me of a standard question all of my PhD students knew was coming, which was, I teach a survey class with 750 students. I have this many topics in there, and the textbook has this. Tell me why your dissertation is so important that I have got to take a topic out and put it back in to make them think and that's another way to think about what is most important that you want your students to know in 15 years. That's the other way to think about it. What should they remember? I'm a little concerned just about reading, and you got that from the students. If there weren't, PowerPoints, displays, that's how you get them. But what about the printed word, whether it's on the screen or otherwise? More questions.
I can just chime in briefly. I didn't hear the question, but I think I heard an interpretation of it. Part of what I do know, as part of our Civil Rights Center, we spent a lot of time away from Columbia. So we had our displays out in the hallway. We came on Thursday, and yesterday one of the students who was visiting from Atlanta said, "How could you have a USC banner at the enemy?" And I said, "What are you I realized where I was. I'm at Clemson with my friend Vernon Burton on this campus. But we travel all around the state. It's my first time in Clemson, but everywhere we go, when we work with either students or teachers, we try to find something relevant on this broad topic to the town or area where we're in. And it resonates. Perfect example is I was with a group of students in Columbia, and they did not, everything you all heard earlier, how the students described this conference, sometimes exciting, oftentimes boring, I heard the same thing. So we got to this topic, Edwardsburg, South Carolina, an important Supreme Court case emerging from Columbia, South Carolina, that they should know, that teachers should know. And then I said, well, right after this photograph is taken, another major event in your textbook occurs. Where is Martin Luther King Jr. in April of 1963? Where is he in mid-April of 1963? He's in Birmingham. And he composes the famous Birmingham letter to from the Birmingham jail, which all is cited in most textbooks. Any anthologized read of American history is very often there. All right? So then I asked the question to the very students in Columbia, well, where is Malcolm X on April 16th and 17th of 1963? And before I came to Columbia, South Carolina, I could never tell you where he was. With this project, I now know. During the course of our research, we were allowed to go into the archives of the state newspaper in Columbia. And initially, the editors of the paper told me that it's unlikely that you'll find much for use. And we were really looking for images to illustrate civil rights. And then one of my graduate students took out a long strip of negatives, and we put them under a light bulb. And he said, "Doc, you might want to come here." I said, "What is it?" He said, "Who does this look like to you?" And I said, "Well, he looks like Malcolm X." And it was a photograph of Malcolm X standing in a small church in Columbia, South Carolina, down the street from the high school where we were giving this workshop. And that resonated. That resonated with the students. And if Vernon and I ever get a chance to come back to Clemson, I want to talk about this. The chaplain of the Clemson University, Charlie Webster, who was instrumental in Harvey Gantt's transition to campus, was at the Malcolm X talk and had a student write a story in this publication called The Tiger. Right. That speaks about black Muslims in Columbia and the role of Malcolm X. I had no idea Malcolm X was ever in Columbia or in South Carolina. And now with that photograph, this Clemson article, you've now done a FOIA request, and now we know J. Edgar Hoover knew exactly where he was in April of 1973.
Probably knew where Charlie Webster was too.
Exactly.
What happened to Charlie after the Harvey Gantt thing? Just to reiterate, I've done a lot of workshops on actually local history. And when I went to Illinois, they gave me a pretty hard time about my accent and things, but I was into it. And in a class for 750 students, I had them all go get one page out of their manuscript census population. And I actually was asked to quit doing it. We had too many history majors. I mean, all these engineers. It's amazing when you start looking at your own community and begin to think about it. That's another thing to think about. It's just a way, and there are a lot of others. I don't want to go there. You can ask me anytime. And you got these experts here. I think it's very important that we ask questions. And I want to emphasize, Jim's the one that got me doing the historiography. I did it to the fourth graders. You told me fourth graders. No wonder I went down a level on you and actually went into the schools in Urbana-Champaign, and they love it. You're using it exactly. And boy, they shot some teachers about the historians say, just because this one exists, it's really good. And one of the things that's very important, I don't want to do this whole workshop on local history. The difference between antiquarianism and history, and I tell this to the fourth graders along with historiography, is this. And if you emphasize, they can get really excited. History by nature is comparative. And then you understand that Martin Luther King Jr. is here, someone else, what else is happening wherever at the same time, and begin to look for those bigger patterns. So that's another thing that sort of became a little motto that when I would work with the public schools, and we'd try to figure out, well, what is history then? What's the difference between that and genealogy? What's the difference? But, because facts are interesting, different things interest other people, but historians have to be history, at least from my perspective, it has to be comparative. I got a lot of trouble. The chair of the department at Illinois said, Vernon, how can you justify teaching the American South when we're teaching global history? This is where it is. And he came back 2 years later and he says, well, global history is not doing so well, but Southern history is the largest enrollment that we have at the University of Illinois. But I was not teaching, I was teaching American history and world history with the South, because to understand the South, you've got to understand where it fits, why there is or is not a South. Just an example. Well, I've talked more than I meant to. Any other questions before I do yeah, go ahead.
If y'all could just speak about the new battles over history, the political battles over creating state standards. I know Rush Limbaugh is involved in some things on that. It's kind of like a new Dunning school per se. But I'm just wondering how serious is that, and how are we supposed to grapple with that, especially when a lot of the school report cards are determined by the EOC and whoever's making the test, and you have school administrators who make us beholden to talk about that.
You might want to get a hold of, well, actually, there's a new chapter in Teaching What Really Happened about that, kind of. It's actually called Truth. Oh, and let me recommend one other thing to you, and this is about Confederate monuments. It's a speech called Truth. I think the title of the speech is astounding, by Mayor Landrieu. the day after, or as he was taking down the statues in New Orleans, he wrote and delivered a speech called Truth. And if you can find it, oh, here's a website you need to go to. You can find it at HNN, which is either hnn.us. Well, that'll get you there. That's H as in history, and NN as in news network, okay? And all of you, I would recommend you get on the email list. You get typically 2 emails a week, so it won't kill you. And you can delete them. You know how to delete them. But it talks about, HNN talks about issues like that, talks about when history makes the news. And then they also have book reviews, all kinds of other stuff that's useful. I blog there. You might want to read my blog. But you can, if you just put into Google HNN and Mayor Landrieu, you'll get this speech, for instance. It's many other places on the web. It went viral. How many of you read this speech or heard it? Oh, well, okay, you all should do that, especially if down here in Dixie you should, but so should people in Idaho. It's a terrific speech, and it relates to issues like, aren't we tearing down statues like the Taliban? No, etc. But in the new chapter in here, and also in the new preface to Lies My Teacher Told Me, I talk about some of these issues. One of them is, I think, academic historians, especially really academic ones, and I mean academic kind of in the pejorative sense, like the students were complaining about to some extent, the high school students, they've gotten themselves into a situation where they don't want to use words like truth and false. A catchphrase, and I actually quote a couple of them in there, a catchphrase in graduate school for the last 20 years is, why should we privilege one narrative over others with the term true? And I reply stupidly, on purpose stupidly, right. And the Civil War started in 1875. It grew out of a pay dispute between the Union Pacific Railroad and its Chinese workers in Nevada. And literally people say, what? Of course, because everything in that statement is false. And so there is maybe such a thing as truth and falsity. And of course, then they say, well, that's too easy. And then I get into this issue that I just did with you all about why did the Confederacy secede? And I mean, usually that's seen as a kind of a little bit of a matter of opinion or something. And it's no more a matter of opinion than did the Civil War start in Nevada or in South Carolina. It is a matter of truth. And yet some other things that we teach kind of, this is how it happened, we don't know for sure, and there's issues involved. And so we got to think about these things. I think that the new issue, the new emphasis on the core standards, the Common Core, is helpful to us if we think about it, because it originally comes out to emphasize we want students to think critically, read critically, do some things in depth rather than so many things shallowly. Sounds pretty good, Now, it's being perverted already before our very eyes into some more multiple choice tests. And these are twig tests. It is possible to write a deep, thoughtful, multiple choice question, but I don't think it's possible for Pearson or these other companies to do this. I've never seen them do it. So we have to make sure that we are actually getting students to do serious work, make up portfolios, get into serious issues and so on. Now about you kind of want to get into the right-wing radio commentators and those kinds of issues. And I think the best thing to do there is, on many issues, go back to primary sources. I mean, people cannot call you a revisionist if you are holding up South Carolina's document of secession from December 24th. They passed it on Christmas Eve, 1860. That's not exactly revisionism. The revisionism happened in 1890. You're divisioning it, or whatever the opposite of that is. You're going back to the. Does that speak to some of what you asked? You want to ask a follow-up?
Yeah, I could just add quickly to that. It relates to South Carolina. So have you all read the new standards? Those who teach the newest standards, the 2020 standards. South Carolina. Yeah. Well, do read them because it's a series of iterations. So the current standards that were in place was 2007. Can't remember the year. And a new set of standards came out about 6 months ago that just blew me away. They were disturbing. They were troubling and disturbing, and but the Department of Education solicited requests for input, revisions, and what I was just sent this week is vastly improved. It includes many of the things I just talked about, and those things were not referenced in the last draft. So vigilance and activism in responding to that initial draft has led to improvements. It's not been fully adopted yet, but we'll see.
Thank you. I meant to make one other statement. Most states have passed things like he talked about, not necessarily maybe so detailed. It sounds like you guys are more on the Texas twig level of saying what's in and what's out. But Mississippi, Massachusetts, a lot of states have passed, you have to, Mississippi, for instance, for 30 years at least, has said you have to teach accurate history about the civil rights movement. Well, who can argue with that, right? Et cetera. They have a whole bunch. Usually the state standards have all kinds of useful things that you can make use of. I'm going to speak bluntly, to hide behind if somebody complains about your teaching. Well, I'm just doing what the state tells me to because they say I'm supposed to teach accurate history about X, and that's what I'm doing. But I want to make sure you had another sentence.
That answered. I was just talking about like sort of the political battles over, American exceptionalism, which kind of masks some of the realities of history, a way to sort of divorce yourself from what actually happened, because it doesn't fit a political agenda. And I think that's just a real grave threat that we all have as history teachers. And some administrators don't want you to be controversial. I mean, I remember when I first started teaching, I had a principal, an African-American lady, who didn't want me to show pictures of lynching, which I can understand, but it still, there's nothing more powerful than showing that, so it does show that divide there. So that's all I want to say.